Chapter 23 of The Four Faces by William le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 23 Relates a Queer Adventure. Up the great stairway, slowly, very carefully, came four men carrying a stretcher. The form extended upon it was completely covered by a white sheet, all but the feet. A man's feet. Behind and on each side were men, apparently gentlemen, all strangers to me. So deeply occupied were their thoughts, seemingly, that they appeared not to notice Albeury, Dulcie and myself as we stepped aside to let them pass. For the moment my attention was distracted. What had happened? Had there been an accident? If so, who was the victim, and who were these men with him? "Can you show me the way to room 88?" one of the leading bearers asked as he came up to me. He stopped, waiting for me to answer, and as he did so the men beside the stretcher gathered about me, so that for the instant I lost sight of Dulcie, who had instinctively stepped back a pace or two. I indicated the whereabouts of the room. "And can you tell me which is Mr. Berrington's room?" he then asked. "Yes, but I am Mr. Berrington. What is it you want?" "You are? Are you Michael Berrington?" "Yes." "Oh, then you had better come with us now. Whom are you carrying? What has happened?" Without answering, he moved onward down the corridor with the stretcher. I walked a little way ahead, and at the room numbered 88, Mrs. Stapleton's room, I knocked. Again I was face to face with the woman. Seated in an armchair, a cigarette between her lips, she appeared to be reading a newspaper. Upon seeing me she rose abruptly. Then, as the covered stretcher was borne slowly in, I saw the cigarette fall from her lips on to the floor, and with surprised, frightened eyes she gazed inquiringly at the bearers, then down at the outline of the figure beneath the sheet. "Who is it?" she gasped. "Tell me who it is, and why he has been brought here." Nobody answered, though now the bearers, also the men who accompanied them, had all crowded into the room. Suddenly I noticed that the door of the room had been shut, and instantly the thought came to me. Where was Dulcie? What had become of her? Also, where had Albeury gone? Hardly had the thought flashed into my mind when I was pounced upon from behind, a hand covered my mouth, my wrists were tied tightly behind me and my feet bound with a cord. Now I saw the figure that had lain beneath the sheet upon the stretcher rise up of its own accord. The covering fell away, and Gastrell stood before me. I saw him make a sign. At once a gag was crammed into my mouth with great force, so that I could neither cry out nor speak. In a few moments I had been lifted by two men, extended on my back upon the stretcher, and the white cloth had been thrown over me, covering me completely. Now, the stretcher being raised, I knew that I was being conveyed along the corridor. I was being carried down the stairs, slowly, carefully. In the hall I heard a confused murmur of voices. Somebody was telling someone that the poor fellow was more seriously hurt than had at first been supposed, and that they were taking him to the hospital. Suddenly I recognized a voice. It was Albury's, and he spoke in French. Presently I knew that I was being carried out of the hotel and down the hotel steps. I was being lifted into a car. The ends of the stretcher rested upon the seats. There were expressions of sympathy. Questions were being asked and answered in French. The door of the car was shut quietly, and the car swept away. For 20 minutes or more we passed through the streets of Paris, slowing down at frequent intervals, turning often to right or left. Gradually the sound of the traffic passing grew less, our speed increased, and I judged that we must now be out in the environs. Now we were going slowly up a steep hill. We reached the top of it, and our speed increased considerably. On and on we sped. We must, I gathered, have travelled well over an hour, and now be far out in the country. There was no light inside the car, and though still covered by the sheet, I somehow seemed to feel that the night was very dark. In what direction had we come? Whereabouts, outside Paris, was that long hill up which we had travelled so slowly? Suddenly someone inside the car moved. An instant later the sheet over my face was pulled back. In the darkness I could still see nothing, but I felt that some one was staring down at me. How many occupants the car contained, of course, I could not tell. Still no one spoke, and for 5 minutes or more the car tore faster and faster along the straight country road. Then all at once a light flashed in my eyes, the light of an electric torch. "You have but a few minutes to live," a man's voice exclaimed in a low tone. "If you want to say your prayers, you had better do so now." The voice was clearly Gastrell's. Now I realized that 2 men besides myself were in the enclosed car. The light from the electric torch still shone down upon my face. My eyes grew gradually accustomed to the bright light which had at first dazzled them. "This is to be your fate," Gastrell continued a minute later. "At a spot that we shall presently come to, far out in the country, 50 miles from Paris, you will be taken out, bound as you are, and shot through the head. The revolver has your initials on it. Look." He held something before my eyes in such a way that I could see it clearly in the disc of light. It was a pistol's grip. On it shone a little metal plate, on which I could distinctly see the engraved initials M.B. "When you are dead, your wrists and legs will be released, and you will be left by the roadside in the forest we are now in, the revolver with its one discharged chamber on the ground beside you. Look, whose handwriting is this?" A letter was passed into the ring of light. I started, for the writing was apparently my own, though certainly I had not written the letter. It was written on notepaper with the Continental Hotel heading, and my handwriting and signature had been forged, a wonderful facsimile of both. On the envelope, which was stamped, were written, also apparently by me, the name and address: "Miss Dulcie Challoner, Holt Manor, Holt Stacey, Berkshire, England." "My dear Dulcie," the letter ran, "I hope you will forgive me the dreadful act I am about to commit, and forget me as quickly as possible. I am not insane, though at the inquest the coroner will probably return a verdict of suicide during temporary insanity. But my life for years past has been one continuous lie, and from the first I have deceived you most shamefully. I asked you to become my wife, yet I am already married, and have been for some years. Though I am very fond of you, I do not love you, nor have I ever loved you. The things I have said and hinted about your friend Mrs. Stapleton were all utterly false. They emanated entirely from my imagination and were wholly without foundation. This is all I have to say, except again, forgive me. Your sincere and miserable friend, Michael Berrington." The letter was undated. What my feelings were when I had read that letter I find it impossible to describe. The fury of indignation that surged up within me as the car continued to glide smoothly along with unabated speed seemed to drive from my thoughts the sensation of terror which had at first possessed me. Death would be awful enough, especially such a death, but that Dulcie should think I had intentionally and consistently deceived her, that she should be made to believe I had never loved her, and that I had wantonly taken my life like a common coward, were too fearful to think about. In an access of mad passion I wildly jerked my wrists again and again in vain attempts to get free. My mouth was still gagged, or I should have called loudly in the desperate hope that even in the deserted spot we were in the cry might be heard and bring assistance. Oh, those moments of frantic mental torture! To this day I can hardly bear to think of them. Gradually I grew calmer. The electric torch had been extinguished, and we still swept on through the darkness. If only the engine would give out, I kept thinking. If only the car would for some reason break down. If only an accident of any sort would happen, I might yet escape the terrible fate awaiting me. To think that a crime such as this could be committed with impunity, worse still, that my name should be handed down to posterity, dishonoured and disgraced. To be shot like a dog, with arms and legs bound like a felon's. The more I strove to distract my thoughts, the more my mind dwelt upon the immediate future. What would Sir Roland think, and Jack Osborne, and all my friends, even old Aunt Hannah? While pretending to feel pity, how they would inwardly despise me for my apparent cowardice. That cruel letter, too, it would be printed in the newspapers. Yet even that I could have borne with fortitude, I thought, if by some means Dulcie could be made to know that the letter which in a day or two would be found upon my dead body had not been written by me, and that I had not taken my life. The car was slowing down. Presently it stopped. Once more the disc of light shone down upon my face. Quickly my disguise as Sir Aubrey Belston, which I still wore, wig, moustache and eyebrows, whiskers and beard, was removed. Hurriedly my face and neck were rubbed all over with a sponge soaked in some greasy liquid smelling strongly of turpentine, then rapidly dried with a cloth. Next, 2 men raised me off the stretcher, lifted me out of the car and set me on my feet, propping me against the car to prevent my falling over, for my legs were still tightly bound. Instinctively I glanced about me. We seemed to be in the depths of some forest. The road we were on was rather narrow. On both sides of it dark pine trees towered into the sky, which itself was inky, neither moon nor stars being visible. A light breeze moaned mournfully up the forest. As I stood there, unconsciously listening, the sound seemed to chill me. In vain I strained my ears again, in the mad hope that even at this last moment help of some sort might arrive. To right and left I looked along the road, but the blackness was as dense as the blackness of the sky above. The lamps of the car had been extinguished. Now the only light visible was the glow of the electric torch. For a moment it flashed upon a face, and on the instant I recognized Gastrell, also a man I knew by sight, though not by name. So these were my persecutors, 2 men moving in the best society, and wholly unsuspected of anything approaching crime. They were to be my murderers. Even in that moment of crisis I found myself unconsciously wondering who the driver of the car could be, for obviously he too must be implicated in this plot and a member of the gang. Another thought flashed through my mind. Which of all these criminals had done poor Churchill to death? Which had assassinated Preston on board the boat, leaving the impression that he had intentionally hanged himself? Was Gastrell the assassin? "Here's a place, beside this tree." The remark, uttered by the stranger, cut my train of thought. Now Gastrell stood beside me. In one hand he held the torch. The fingers of his other hand were unfastening my coat. Soon I felt him push his hand, with a letter in it, into my inside pocket. The letter intended for Dulcie. The letter which would besmirch my name, dishonour and disgrace it for ever. In a fit of mad frenzy I tugged wildly at my bonds again in frantic attempts to free myself. As well might I have tried to free myself from handcuffs. Calmly Gastrell rebuttoned my coat, heedless of my struggles. "And when you are dead," he said quietly, "Holt Manor and estates, and the Challoner fortune will come eventually to my companions and myself. For Connie, in spite of what she said, is going to marry Roland Challoner, and I intend to marry Dulcie, if she likes it or if she doesn't. So now you realize, I hope, when it is too late, how ill-advised you and your folk were to attempt to overthrow our plans. Several before you have tried, and all have failed. The majority are dead. Very likely more will try, and they too will fail. You know the fate of Churchill and of Preston. You know your own fate. Osborne has saved himself by becoming one of us, for when he marries Jasmine he will join us, or else." He stopped abruptly. A moment later he added, "2 of your friends we still have to reckon with, though neither counts for much, Challoner's sister and his son." A cold sweat broke out upon me as the ruffian mentioned Dick. God! Was it possible these fiends would wreak their vengeance on a mere boy? And yet if they meant to, how could he escape them? How simple for such men to get him in their power! Ah, if only I could have spoken I should, I truly believe, have humiliated myself by beseeching the monsters to spare poor little Dick. "Come, hurry along," the stranger, who was standing by, exclaimed impatiently. "Bob!" Gastrell called, without heeding the interruption. At once the driver of the car approached. He spoke no word. The disc of light shone upon his face and "Pull your cap off," Gastrell said sharply. The fellow did so. As I stared hard at him, Something in his face seemed familiar to me. Fat and bloated though the face was, and though the eyes sagged, in the man's expression there was something. Gastrell turned to me. "Don't you see the likeness?" he asked quickly. Gagged as I was, of course I couldn't speak. "Bob is Sir Roland's brother, Robert Challoner," he said. "At Holt his name is never spoken, but you have heard of him. Bob Challoner was kicked out of his home, first by his father, Sir Nelson Challoner, and afterwards by his own brother, Sir Roland. I will now tell you it was Bob who suggested the robbery at Holt, and who with Connie helped us through with it. He is going now to see to it that Dulcie becomes my wife." "Stop your talk, for God's sake," the stranger interrupted again, his patience at an end. "Time is slipping by. Bring him here and finish him." They carried me a little way into the forest, then set me on my feet again, propped against a tree. That I did not feel utterly terrified at the thought of my approaching death astonished me. After the mental torture I had endured, however, I felt comparatively calm. Gastrell approached to within about a yard. Again the wind moaned up through the forest. No other sound whatever broke the night's stillness. Once more a disc of light shone straight into my eyes, though now from a distance of a few inches only. I saw the muzzle of a pistol glitter above the light. I knew now that the electric torch was connected with the weapon. There came a sharp, metallic click as Gastrell cocked the hammer. End of chapter 23. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudiobooks.com. Chapter 24 of The Four Faces by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 24. In Strange Company. A loud report rang out just behind me. The light before my eyes vanished. Something lurched up against my chest, knocking the breath out of me, then collapsed in a heap onto the ground at my feet. There was an instant's stillness. Now footsteps could be heard crackling forward through the undergrowth. There came the sound of a heavy blow, a stifled cry, a dull thud as though a body had fallen heavily. What had happened, and what was happening? Helplessly I stared about me, striving in vain to pierce the blackness of the forest. I heard people moving close beside me, but no word was spoken. Then suddenly someone touched me. The ropes which bound my wrists were being severed with a blunt instrument. Now my legs were being released. Some fragments of ropes dropped to the ground. I was free. Nowhere was there any light, and still nobody spoke. Taking me by the arm, the man who had set me free led me forward through the darkness. Now we were close to the car. Men were beside it, apparently very busy, though what they were engaged in doing I could not ascertain. And then, all at once, the road became flooded with light. The headlights of the car had been switched on simultaneously. Almost immediately I saw what was happening. Several large bags had been placed inside the car, and others were being pushed in after them. What did they contain? For the moment I was puzzled. Then suddenly the obvious truth flashed across me. The group of men, I could see them indistinctly in the darkness, must be poachers, and poaching out of season I knew to be an offence punishable in France with a very heavy sentence. There seemed to be 5 men engaged in handling the sacks, while a 6th stood looking on. "Entrez," a voice beside me said suddenly. At the same instant I was gripped by the arm and pushed forward towards the car. "Who fired that shot?" I exclaimed quickly in French. "I did, and saved your life," the man who held me answered. "Why?" "And you killed him?" "Yes." "The report sounded like a rifle shot." "It was a pistol shot, but what matters so long as he is dead?" "Have you his revolver? Did you pick it up?" I asked anxiously. "Yes. Show me both pistols." My thoughts were travelling with extraordinary rapidity. Rather to my surprise, he handed the pistols to me without a word. Quickly I held them in the light cast by the car's lamps and hurriedly examined them. Yes, both were weapons of the same calibre. Both took the same cartridges. Below the barrel of Gastrell's revolver was the small electric lamp from which the light had shone on my face. I gripped the pistol tightly, and the light shone out again. "I will return here in a moment," I said in French, as I moved away, for the man had released my arm. With the help of the pistol glow light, I made my way back to the tree where a few minutes before I had been propped up, helpless. On the ground, close to the trunk, Gastrell's body lay huddled in a heap, a red spot in the middle of his forehead, showing that death must indeed have been instantaneous. I had, however, no time for reflection. Quickly I thrust my hand into the dead man's pockets, one after another. All were empty. Someone must already have gone through them. Glancing about me to make sure I was not observed, I hastily transferred to the dead man's pocket from the inside pocket of my own coat the letter which he himself had placed there not 10 minutes before. Then I rebuttoned his coat, picked up the bits of severed rope lying about, the ropes that previously had bound me, threw the pistol on the ground close to the dead man's hand, and turned to retrace my steps. Suddenly I stopped. I had forgotten something. Picking up the pistol again, I fired a shot into the air, then once more threw it down. My ruse would have proved truly futile had Gastrell's body been discovered, shot through the head, a letter in his pocket pointing directly to suicide, and a revolver on the ground, still loaded in every chamber. A minute later I was hustled into the car, squeezed tightly between several men. On the floor of the car were a number of large sacks, exhaling an odour none too savoury. The door was slammed, I saw a figure step onto the driving seat, and once more the powerful car shot out into the night, its search lamps lighting up the road as far as we could see. For a while nobody spoke. "I don't know who you are," I said at last in French, breaking the silence, "but I am most grateful to you for saving my life." Still nobody uttered. "On my return to England," I continued, "I shall prove my gratitude in a way you may not expect. Meanwhile, I should like to know if you heard what happened, what was said, after the car pulled up and I was lifted out of it." "We heard everything," one of the men answered in English, out of the darkness. "The man who shot your enemy is driving this car now." "And may I ask where we are going?" I said, as the car still tore along the white, undulating road, scattering the darkness on either side and far ahead, for we were still deep in the forest. "Yes, we shall stop first at Chalon-sur-Marne to deposit these," and he indicated the sacks, which I had by now discovered contained dead pheasants, tightly packed. "And then?" "You will see." Later I gathered from them that the police, as well as gamekeepers, were their deadliest enemies. That night, it seemed, they had been almost captured by some of the forest keepers who had succeeded in securing their car. The car we were in, they told me quite frankly, they intended to get rid of at once in a far distant town. That town we were now on our way to. After leaving Chalon we should not stop until we got there. The car, they added, had happened to pull up close to where they lay hidden. Upon discovering that it contained only 4 men, including the driver, they had intended to overpower all of us and seize the car. Then, overhearing some of the conversation, they had decided to pause and await developments. Owing to that decision it was that my life had so fortunately been saved. "And how do you poach the birds?" I asked a little later. As they became gradually more talkative, we began to grow quite friendly. They laughed. "It is easily done," one of them answered, and went on to explain that the method they adopted consisted in burning brimstone under the trees where the pheasants roosted, the fumes causing the birds to tumble off their perches and down to the ground. They further told me that different parts of the forest teemed with different kinds of game, and that most of it was preserved. In the section we had just been in, pheasants were most abundant. Poached out of season they were additionally valuable, being placed in cold storage directly they were sold and eventually exported. Equally ingenious were the methods they employed for poaching other sorts of game. Some of these methods they described to me in detail, and certain dealers in the town of Chalon, they ended, were always ready to receive it. At last we passed out of the forest, which I felt glad to leave behind. Now the road twisted a good deal, also it grew more hilly. The darkness, however, became gradually less intense. In Chalon we pulled up in a curious little street. The driver, having clambered down, knocked 3 times at a small door. Instantly it was opened. The sacks, one after another, were handed in, the door shut noiselessly, and once more we started off. "Have you any idea," I asked suddenly, "what became of the companions of the man who meant to kill me?" "Yes," came the immediate reply. "One of them attacked us and was knocked senseless." "And the other?" "I can't say. He suddenly disappeared. We emptied the dead man's pockets to prevent, if possible, his identity being established. You might tell us who he was and all about him." I had already told them a good deal, but now I told them more, explaining eventually how I had come to be with Hugesson Gastrell and his companion, and the wastrel Robert Challoner, why they had wished to murder me, how they had already murdered Churchill and George Preston, and the reason they had done so. Miscreants of sorts themselves, as I now knew, they became immensely interested. As we proceeded, I told them of the letter that Gastrell had pushed into my pocket, and how, on the following day, it would be found in his own pocket. "So that until I reveal myself," I added, "I shall, after the discovery of that letter, be dead to my friends and relatives. That, according to a plan I have now thought out, should facilitate my getting the gang arrested, if not in France, at any rate in England." On and on the car sped at the same regular speed. Village after village was left behind. Now and again we skirted large towns, keeping, however, well without their boundaries. What departments we travelled through I had not the least idea. The driver's knowledge of the country was remarkable. Upon my expressing surprise at the geographical knowledge he possessed, they told me that at one time he had been chauffeur to a nobleman who moved about a great deal. When I pulled out my watch I found it was 2:30. "I wish you would tell me how much further you are going," I said at last, yawning. "How many more hours are we going on like this?" "We are now on our way to Lyons," the man who had last spoken answered quickly. The cigar that he was lighting cast a red glow in his face. "To sell the car nearer Paris wouldn't be safe. Besides, in Lyons we have a purchaser awaiting it. We have passed Troyes, Châtillon and Dijon. We are now in the department of Saône-et-Loire." Again we sank into silence. The soft purring of the car seemed to increase our drowsiness. Colder and colder the night air grew. In my evening clothes and thin overcoat I felt it very keenly. I suppose I must have dozed, for when presently I opened my eyes, the streaks of dawn were visible. My neck and limbs were stiff, and, as I looked about me dully, I saw that my companions, one and all, were fast asleep. I turned, rubbed the frosted glass in front of me, and peered out at the driver. There he sat, motionless, almost rigid, his hands still gripping the wheel, his gaze set straight ahead. That the cold outside must be intense I knew, yet he seemed not to notice it. At a village beyond Lyons we stopped for breakfast and to cool the engine, but in less than half an hour we were on the road again. As the car swiftly passed over one of the bridges at Lyons, a church clock was striking 8. Gradually slackening speed, we turned abruptly to the right, then began a maze of narrow streets. At last, at a quiet-looking hotel out on the road to Vienne, we stopped, and I knew that our journey of 300 miles or so was at last at an end. Café au lait was served for us in a private room on the first floor, and I was able, for the first time, to scrutinize my companions closely. 6 in all, they certainly looked a dare-devil, reckless lot. To guess from their appearance what their trade or calling had originally been seemed impossible. 2 of them might certainly have belonged to the farmer class, had the expression in their eyes been less cunning, less intelligent. The man who had saved my life, and whom I judged to be their leader, was tall, dark, thick-set, with a heavy beard and moustache, and dark, deep-set eyes. His voice, full and resonant, was not unpleasant. Seldom have I seen a man who looked so absolutely fearless. It was, I suppose, the confidence they felt that I should not betray them after what had happened that made them speak so freely before me. That very morning, I gathered, they would rid themselves of the car to a big receiver of stolen goods, whose headquarters were in Lyons, the largest receiver of stolen goods in the whole of Europe, so they said. With the money thus obtained they would buy a car to replace the one seized on the previous night. It was interesting to find that these lordly thieves and poachers found a car essential to enable them to carry on their business. The time for parting soon arrived, and once more I thanked my rescuer and his accomplices for the great service they had rendered me. That a human life should have been sacrificed was terrible to think of. And yet the reflection that, but for the sacrifice of Gastrell's life, I should myself have been lying dead, set my mind at ease. And after all, I said mentally, the death of a man like Gastrell must do more good than harm. The first thing I did after leaving them was to buy some clothes and other necessaries, and a valise to pack them in. After that I set out for a quiet stroll through the quaint old town, which I had never before visited. Reviewing the situation as I walked slowly along, and debating in my mind whether to return to Paris or go straight back to England by the next boat, various possibilities presented themselves in turn. Virtually, I was dead to all my friends in England, or I should be in a day or two, when the letter which would be found in Gastrell's pocket had been printed in the newspapers. That belief, I felt, would help me to carry out the plan I had formed for discovering at first hand the actual movements of the gang, some members of which would, I felt sure, be present at Eldon Hall for the coming of age festivities of Lord Cranmere's oldest son. Yet what about Dulcie? I felt that I must see her, and see her as soon as possible. That thought it was which now entirely obsessed me. To see her meant, of course, that I must at once return to Paris, for almost certain she would still be there. True, her last words, uttered in the corridor of the Continental, had convinced me that she now strongly suspected Connie, that she wished to get away from her. But would she succeed in getting away? Already I had proofs of the woman's extraordinary will power, and Dulcie, I knew, had been hypnotized by her more than once. I had doubts of Dulcie's ability to resist the woman's spell. Obviously, then, my duty lay before me. I must at once return to Paris. I must see Dulcie again, if possible, see her in private. I must get her away from that woman and take her back to England, no matter how great the risk I might have to run. And what, I wondered suddenly, was Albeury doing all this time? Still pondering all this, I sauntered into a restaurant I happened to be passing, ordered a bottle of wine, and asked for a copy of the latest railway timetable. The Rapide for Paris was due, I saw, to leave Lyons Perrache at 8 that night. That would suit me well, and I at once decided to go by it. Then, having nothing to do until the time of starting, I once more strolled out into the town. A newsboy was shouting the news, and I bought a paper from him. Almost the first headline upon which my glance rested stirred a recollection in my mind. Where before had I heard that name? The Duchess de Montparnasse. Ah, now I remembered. When Jack Osborne, confined so mysteriously in the house in Grafton Street in London, had been cross-questioned in the dark, he had been asked various questions concerning the Duchess de Montparnasse, and now right before me was an account of a strange robbery, a robbery committed the day before at the Duchess's great château on the Meuse. At once I guessed that this robbery must be yet another of the gang's outrages. My suspicion became conviction when, on reading further, I learned that it had taken place on the occasion of a great reception, when the servants at the château had been busily engaged. The goods stolen, the report ended, were valued at many thousands of pounds. Finding little else of interest in the paper, I continued my ramble. Glancing at my watch, I found it was past 6. At that moment it was that, turning aimlessly into a side street, I came suddenly face to face with François, my rescuer. "We seem fated to meet," he exclaimed in his patois French, and he laughed. He looked hard at me for some moments. Then, as though his mind were suddenly made up, he said abruptly: "I wonder, Mr. Berrington, I fancy that by nature you are inquisitive. If you would like to see something you have never seen before. I don't believe you fully realize how implicitly I now trust you. I should like to prove it to you." "I should like to see it immensely," I answered, wondering what on earth, in the nature of a novelty, such a man could have to show me. "Come," he said in the same tone, linking his arm in mine, "I will show it to you now. As I say, I have no fear at all that you will betray me, yet there isn't another living person, excepting my own accomplices, I would take where I am going to take you now." Down the side street he had just come up I followed him. We turned to the right again, then to the left. A little further on he stopped at a greengrocer's shop, a small, insignificant shop with one window only. "Wait here," he said as he entered. A minute later he reappeared and beckoned to me. "My friend," he said, presenting me to a cadaverous man of middle age, with a thin, prominent, rather hooked nose, high cheekbones, and curious eyes of a steely grey, which bushy eyebrows partly concealed. The man looked at me keenly, but he neither smiled nor spoke, nor did he offer to shake hands. We were now inside the shop. Quickly we passed into an inner room, and thence to a room beyond it. The room was lined apparently with bookshelves. Advancing to a corner of it, after carefully locking the door, the cadaverous man, standing on tiptoe, pressed what appeared to be a book in the topmost shelf. At once a door in the bookshelves opened. In the silence we followed him through it, and the door shut noiselessly behind us. I suppose we had walked 10 or 12 yards along the narrow, low-ceilinged, uncarpeted passage, lit only by the candle lantern that our guide had unhooked from a nail in the wall, when he suddenly stopped and bent down. Now I saw that he was lifting the boards, one after another. A few moments later the upper rungs of a ladder became visible. François descended. I followed carefully. I counted 15 rungs before I reached the ground, and the gaunt man came after me, shifting the boards back into position above his head when he was halfway down the ladder. The darkness here was denser than it had been in the passage above, but the lantern served its purpose. We were in a much narrower passage now, so low that we had to stoop to make our way along it. The ceiling was roughly hewn, so was the ground we walked upon. Half a dozen steps along the rough ground and we stopped again. Facing us was a low, extremely narrow door, apparently an iron door. It resembled the door of a safe. Fitting a key into it, the gaunt man pushed it open, and one by one we entered. At once I became aware of a singular change in the atmosphere. In the narrow, cavernous, obviously subterraneous little passage we had just left, the air had been humid, chill, and dank, with an unpleasant earthy odour. Here it was dry and stuffy, as if heated artificially. So intense was the blackness that I seemed almost to feel it. There was a dull thump. Turning, I saw that the cadaverous man had shut this door too. Just as I was wondering why he took such precautions, something clicked beside me, and the chamber was flooded with light. For an instant the glare blinded me. Then, as I looked about me, the sight that met my gaze made me catch my breath. Was this an Aladdin's palace I had suddenly entered? Had my brain become deranged, causing a strange and amazing hallucination? Or was I asleep and dreaming? End of chapter 24. Recording by Tom Weiss, tomsaudiobooks.com. Chapter 25 of the Four Faces by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 25. The Glittering Underworld. Never shall I forget that astounding spectacle. Even as I think of it now, it arises once more before me. The room, though low, was very long and very broad. I guessed at once that it originally must have been a cellar, or possibly a series of cellars. Now, as the brilliant electric rays from a dozen powerful ceiling lamps shone down through their tinted shades, they lit up a collection of treasure such as few indeed can have gazed upon. Heaped upon trays on tables all about the room were unset precious stones of every conceivable description, which glittered and scintillated in the most wonderful way imaginable. Upon the floor, in rough, uncovered boxes, heaps of gold bracelets and brooches, gold rings and gold chains, gold ornaments and trinkets, and bits of miscellaneous jewellery were piled high in inextricable confusion, as though they had been tossed there to be thrown on to a waste heap. Upon the ground were bars of gold, the thickness of a brick, ranged carefully in rows. At one end of the room was a small smelting furnace, not now alight, and above it an iron brazier. Upon the walls hung sets of furs, many sealskin and ermine, while at one side of the room upon the ground lay piled up some thousands of silver spoons and forks, also silver drinking cups and candlesticks, many silver salvers, and an endless assortment of silver articles of every kind. When at last I had recovered from my astonishment, I turned abruptly to François, who stood at my elbow. "This, I suppose," I said, speaking in a whisper, "is a sort of clearing house for stolen property?" He nodded. "The largest in the whole of France," he added a moment later, "the largest, possibly, anywhere in Europe. Stolen goods come here from all the continental centres, also from Great Britain, the United States, and even from Australia." "But surely," I said, "the police know of this place?" "They know that it exists, but they don't know where it is. You see how implicitly I trust you? What faith I place in the honour of a gentleman?" "I think not," I corrected. "You know that my tongue is tied, because you saved my life. That is why you trust me." He smiled grimly. "But why have you brought me here?" I asked after a pause. "For the reason I have named to show how implicitly I trust you." It was only then that a thought flashed in upon me. "You say," I exclaimed sharply, "that jewellery stolen in Great Britain sometimes finds its way here?" "Most of the English stuff is got rid of in this room." "And do your clients tell you where the stuff comes from?" "Always," the gaunt man answered. "That is a condition of my taking it off their hands. You will understand that large rewards are sometimes offered for the return of property, intact and uninjured." I paused to collect my thoughts before speaking again, anxious not to make a false step. "Can you recollect," I said at last, "if jewellery taken from a country house in Berkshire, England the house is called Holt Manor just after Christmas ever found its way here?" The gaunt man reflected for a moment. Then, without speaking, he walked across the room, unlocked the door of a little safe which was let into the wall, took from the safe a fat leather bound ledger, opened it, and ran his finger down a page. "Yes," he said in his deep voice. "The property was valued at about 12 or 14,000 pounds. I have here a list of the articles." Turning, he peered oddly at me out of his strange eyes. "May I see the list?" I asked quickly. "Have you a reason for wanting to see it?" "Yes. Some of the jewellery taken had been generations in the family. If it is intact still, I may be able to get a fancy price offered for it, or for some of it." "Bien," he said. "Much of the stuff has been melted down, but not all." I read carefully down the list, which, arranged neatly and systematically, showed at once what had been melted down, and how it had been disposed of, while a complete list was given of articles kept intact. Among the latter I recognized several bits of jewellery which Dulcie had greatly valued, and quickly I arranged with the gaunt man to buy them from him then and there. After that the three of us sat talking for a considerable time, and before the time arrived for me to leave I knew beyond doubt that the jewellery I had caught sight of when Connie Stapleton's bag had burst open in the train had been the jewellery, or some of it, stolen on board the boat. "Some day we shall meet again," I said, as I parted from François and his companion in the little greengrocer's shop. "Some day we shall," the cadaverous man answered in a strange voice. He extended his hand, and I shook it. A minute later I was in a taxi, hurrying through the streets of Lyons towards the Perrache station. As the express sped rapidly towards Paris, endless strange reflections and conjectures crowded my brain. Was I acting wisely in thus returning to the French capital, where I might so easily be recognized, seeing how anxious I was that my friends in England should think me dead? I was, I knew, though I did not admit it even to myself, returning to Paris mainly in the hope that I might catch a glimpse of Dulcie. And yet, if I did see her, of what use would it be? Also, what should I do? Let her recognize me, and the plan I had formed to get the scoundrels arrested would most likely be spoiled at once, and more than ever I was now determined to bring them to justice in the end. I fell into a deep sleep, for I was tired out. I had slept little enough during that night-long journey in the stolen car. When I awoke, the train was steaming into Paris. An official, who had aroused me by rubbing his hand upon my cheek, stood awaiting a pourboire. "Go to the Hotel Continental," I said in French to the driver of the taxi into which I had just stepped from my newly bought valise. "Get there as quickly as you can." That I was doing a mad thing in thus returning to the hotel, where in all probability the members of the gang were still staying, I knew. But a man in love hardly reckons with risk, and as I lay back in the taxi, my brain awhirl, I knew that I was as desperately in love as it is possible for man to be. Paris, gay Paris, looked gloomy enough in the dull blue haze which hung over and partly enveloped its deserted, dreary streets. Happening to glance up at the windows of a house with green sun shutters half open, my eyes met those of a faded girl with tousled hair, peering down into the street, and mechanically she ogled me. In disgust I averted my gaze, hating for the moment my own sex, which made such women possible. On and on the car rolled. Some revellers in dishevelled evening clothes, their eyes round and staring, their faces ghastly in the morning light, stumbled out beneath an archway above which a lamp burned dully with an orange glow. Everything and everyone seemed only half awake. The reception clerk at the hotel was sulky and inclined to be argumentative. Yes, he was positive, he said in reply to my inquiry, that nobody of the name of Challoner was staying at the hotel. No, nor yet of the name of Stapleton. They had slept there the night before? Yes, that was quite possible, but he was not concerned with people who had stayed there, only with people who were there then. He had no idea, he added, at what time they had left, nor yet where they had gone. And did I need a room or didn't I? Because if I didn't, I had better go away. His impertinence annoyed me, but I had too much to think about to have time to lose my temper. I told him I needed a room, and I sent up my valise. A bath, a shave, and a change of clothes braced me considerably, and by the time I reached the coffee room I felt thoroughly refreshed. What adventures had befallen me since I had breakfasted in that room only 48 hours before, I reflected, as the waiter approached with the Figaro. Breakfast was laid for 100 or more, but barely a dozen people were in the room. All were strangers to me, so I soon became engrossed in the newspaper. My attention was distracted by the waiter, who, again approaching, turned up 2 chairs at my table. "With all those tables empty," I said to him with a wave of the hand, "you can surely put people elsewhere. I don't want strangers here." He smiled pleasantly, showing me extraordinarily white teeth. "A gentleman and lady wish to sit at monsieur's table," he said, bowing politely and still smiling. "Monsieur will not object?" He seemed so amiable that I felt I couldn't be rude to him. "But who are the lady and gentleman, and why did they specify this table?" I asked, puzzled. The waiter gave a little shrug, raising his eyebrows as he did so. "How can I tell?" he answered. "They come to the door a moment ago, while monsieur is reading his newspaper. You see, monsieur, they speak ensemble in whispers for some moments, it would seem about monsieur, and then they call me and tell me to serve the déjeuner at monsieur's table." Hardly had he stopped speaking when my gaze rested upon 2 people who had just entered and were approaching. One was the police official, Victor Albeury. The other was Dulcie Challoner. They greeted me with, I thought, rather exaggerated nonchalance as they came up, then seated themselves, one on either side of me, Albeury telling the waiter to hurry up with the breakfast that he had ordered 5 minutes ago. I was puzzled, rather than surprised, at the matter-of-fact way that Albeury and Dulcie conversed with me. Few things astonished me now. Had we all been on the best of terms, and met after being separated for half an hour or so, they could hardly have been more composed. For 5 minutes we discussed commonplace topics, when suddenly I noticed that Albeury was looking at me very hard. Dulcie, too, seemed to have grown curiously uneasy. "Whereabouts is he?" Albeury said quickly in a low tone, glancing sharply at Dulcie. The door was at the back. "Gone," she whispered. She seemed greatly agitated. "Mr. Berrington," Albeury said hurriedly, his eyes set on mine. "I suspect that man. They all left last night. He arrived just before they left. I happened to see Doris Lorrimer engaged in earnest conversation with him." "Of whom are you speaking?" I asked, not understanding. "Of the waiter at this table. That polite, unctuous man I saw talking to you. Listen. I have rescued Miss Challoner from Stapleton and her accomplices. We are going to leave Paris for London in less than half an hour. It's not safe for Miss Challoner to stay here longer, and you must travel with us. It is imperative that you should. I can't say more to you now, while that man is hanging about. Tell me quickly, before he returns, what happened to you yesterday. Where were you last night?" "Oh, Mike," Dulcie interrupted, "if you only knew the mental agony I have suffered, all that I endured last night. Mike, I dreamed that you were dead. I dreamed that they had killed you." I stared at her, startled. "They tried to," I almost whispered. "But they failed, and now I—" "Mr. Berrington," Albeury cut in, "you must forgive my brusqueness. Your breakfast will be brought to you in a moment. When it is, don't eat it. Make any excuse you like, but don't eat it." "Good God!" I exclaimed, instantly guessing his thought. "Surely you can't suppose—" "I can and do suppose. More than that, I am practically certain that—" He cut his sentence short, for Dulcie had signalled with her eyes. The waiter had re-entered the room. I breathed more freely when at last the three of us were on our way to the railway station. Strange as it may seem, I had experienced some difficulty in ridding myself of the officious attentions of the smiling, smooth-tongued, extremely plausible waiter. On board the steamer, in a corner of the saloon where none could eavesdrop, I related to Dulcie how I had been bound, gagged, borne out of the hotel upon the stretcher concealed beneath a sheet, and all that had subsequently occurred that I felt justified in telling her. Of the thieves' clearing house in Lyons and my rescuer's connection with it, also of the discovery of the whereabouts of her stolen property, I could of course say nothing, my lips being in honour sealed. A little later, as beneath the stars we slowly paced the deck, the sea was wonderfully smooth for the end of February, Dulcie opened her heart to me, as I had so long hoped she some day would. "Oh, if only you knew!" she suddenly exclaimed in an access of emotion after I had, for a little while, tried to draw her on to talk about herself. "If only you knew all that I have been through, Mike, you would be sorry for me." "Why don't you tell me everything, my darling?" I answered gently, and almost without knowing it, I drew her closer to me. You must know, that I won't repeat to a living soul anything you may say." "Oh, yes, Mike, of course I know," she said, pressing my hands in hers, as though she sought protection. "But there is—" "There is what?" She glanced to right and left, up the dark deck and down it, then gave a little shudder. But for ourselves, the deck was quite deserted. "I hardly know," she almost whispered, and I felt her trembling strangely. "Somehow I feel nervous, frightened. I feel as if some danger were approaching both of us." Again she looked about her. Then, as I spoke soothingly, she gradually grew calmer. "I was very, very fond of Connie Stapleton, you know," she said presently, "and I thought that she liked me. That time at Holt, when you warned me to beware of her, I felt as if I hated you. She influenced me so strangely, Mike. I cannot explain how. Mike, my darling, I tell you this now because somehow I feel you will forgive me, as at last it's all over. It seems so odd now to think of it, but as I grew to love her my love for you seemed to grow less. I knew from the first that she detested my loving you so, and if I spoke much about you to her it annoyed her. She wanted to destroy my love for you, Mike, but never, all the time I have been with her, did I say a word against you. Do you believe me when I tell you that?" Later, she told me that the woman had quite recently hinted at her doing certain things she hardly dared to think about, and that the very day before she had disclosed a horrible plan which she had formulated, in which Dulcie was to play a very important part, a plan to do with a robbery on a very extensive scale. "Oh, Mike, Mike," she went on, "I must have been mad during these past weeks to have listened to what she hinted at. I was mad, or else she had completely hypnotized me. You remember Mr. Osborne being taken to that house in Grafton Street and kept there in confinement, and the telegram I received that was supposed to come from you? Well, I know now who it was who kept him there a prisoner and came to him in the dark, and who questioned him, and tried to get him to reveal information which he alone could give. The man who did that all was—" A footstep just behind us made us both turn quickly. A faint light still shone along the almost dark deck. Before I could recognize the figure, before I had time to speak, Dulcie had sprung suddenly forward and gripped the muffled man by the arm. "Father!" she exclaimed under her breath, with difficulty controlling her emotion. "Father, what are you doing here?" Chapter 25. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 26 of The Four Faces by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 26. That Woman. Sir Roland, whose appearance the cap pulled over his eyes had partly disguised, made a motion with his hand, enjoining silence. Then, linking Dulcie's arm in his, he walked slowly towards the saloon entrance. I walked beside them, but for the moment nobody spoke. We presently found ourselves in a small deserted room, apparently a card room. Here, after carefully shutting the door, Sir Roland seated himself. Then he indicated the seats that he wished us each to occupy, for he was rather deaf. "It is unwise," he said, as he offered me a cigar, "ever to converse privately on the deck of a steamer. Though I have travelled little by sea, I know that on board ship, especially on a small boat like this, voices carry in an extraordinary manner. Standing downwind of you on deck some moments ago, I heard your remarks quite distinctly in spite of my deafness. I even recognized your voices. Until then I did not know you were on board." "But why are you here, father?" Dulcie exclaimed. "When did you leave England?" "I crossed the night before last. Connie wired to me to come at once. She said in her telegram, 'Most urgent,' though she gave no reason for the urgency." "And have you seen her? Where is she now?" "I was to meet her in the lounge of the Hotel Bristol in Paris last night. Punctually at 9 o'clock, the time arranged, I arrived there. I waited until nearly 10, and then a messenger arrived with a note. It was from her. She said in it that she had been telegraphed for to return to England, that she was leaving by the night boat. She expressed deep regret and said she hoped that I would come back to London as soon as possible. And so here I am." Again for some moments nobody spoke. Dulcie was the first to break the silence. "Father," she exclaimed impetuously, "are you really going to are you still determined to marry that woman?" Sir Roland stared at her. "That woman?" he said in surprised indignation. "Whom do you mean by that woman?" "Connie Stapleton, father," she answered, looking him full in the eyes. "Have you the least idea who or what she is?" Sir Roland looked at her aghast. Then, obviously controlling himself, "I know that she has done me the honour of accepting my offer of marriage," he replied with cold dignity. "More than that I don't ask to know. Her circumstances don't interest me. My fortune is ample for both." Dulcie made a gesture of impatience. "For goodness' sake, father!" she exclaimed. "How can you talk like that? Connie Stapleton is—" She turned to me abruptly. "Oh, Mike," she said in a tone of great vexation, "tell him everything. I can't." I cleared my throat to gain time to collect my thoughts. Sir Roland's rather dull stare was set upon my face inquiringly, though his expression betrayed astonishment and keen annoyance. "It's just this, Sir Roland," I said at last, bracing myself to face an unpleasant task. "You, Dulcie, and I too have been completely taken in by Mrs. Stapleton. We believed her to be as charming as she certainly is beautiful. We thought she was a lady. We—" "Thought?" Sir Roland interrupted, cold with anger. "I still consider her to be—" "Will you let me finish? I say we all thought that. I say we supposed that Mrs. Stapleton was just one of ourselves, a lady, an ordinary member of society. Then circumstances arose, events occurred which aroused my suspicions. At first I tried to dispel those suspicions, not only because I liked the woman personally, but because it seemed almost incredible that such a woman, mixing with the right people, received everywhere, could actually be what the circumstances and events I have hinted at pointed to her being. But at last proof came along that Mrs. Stapleton was, as she still is, a common adventuress, or rather an uncommon adventuress, a prominent member of a gang of clever thieves, of a clique of criminals. "Criminals!" Sir Roland stormed, bursting suddenly into passion. Often I have seen him annoyed, but never until now had I seen him actually in an ungovernable fury. "How dare you say the lady I am about to marry is "I have proofs, Sir Roland," I cut in as calmly as I could. "You may doubt my word. You can hardly doubt the word of a famous Continental detective. He is on board. I will bring him here now." As I quietly rose to leave the room, I saw Sir Roland staring, half stupidly, half in a passion still, from Dulcie to me, then back again at Dulcie. Before he could speak, however, I had left the little room and gone in search of Victor Albeury. He was not in his cabin, nor was he in the smoking room, where men still sat playing cards, nor was he in the big saloon. On the forward deck I found him at last, a solitary figure leaning against the stanchion rail, smoking his pipe, and gazing abstractedly out across the smooth sea, his eyes apparently focused upon the black, far distant horizon. Gently I tapped him on the arm, as he seemed unaware of my approach. "Well, Mr. Berrington," he said calmly, without looking round or moving, "what can I do for you?" "Please come at once," I exclaimed. "Sir Roland and Miss Challoner are in the small saloon. We have been trying to explain to Sir Roland that the woman Stapleton is an adventuress. Probably you don't know that she is engaged to be married to Sir Roland. He won't believe a word we say. We want you to come to him, to speak to him and open his eyes." It was no easy matter, however, to get the old man to believe even Albeury's calm and convincing assurance that Connie Stapleton belonged to a gang of infamous people, some of whom we knew beyond question to be cold-blooded assassins. It was due, indeed, largely to Albeury's remarkable personality that in the end he succeeded in altering the opinion Sir Roland had held concerning this woman of whom he was evidently even more deeply enamoured than we already knew him to be. "But she has been such a close friend of yours, Dulcie," he said at last, in an altered tone. "If she is all that you now say she is, how came you to remain so intimate with her all this time?" "She has tricked me, father, just as she has hoodwinked you," she answered with self-assurance that astonished me. "And then she seemed somehow to mesmerize me, to cast a sort of spell over me, so that I came almost to love her and to do almost everything she suggested. By degrees she got me in her power, and then she began to make proposals that alarmed me, and yet I was drawn to her still. Once or twice Mike had warned me against her, but I had refused to believe his warnings. It was only 2 days ago that the crisis came. She didn't ask me to do what she wanted. She told me I must do it, and then, all at once, the scales seemed to fall from my eyes. At last her true nature was revealed to me. It was an awful moment, father, awful." Far into the night the three of us remained talking. At last, when we rose to separate, Albeury turned to me. "I sleep with you in your cabin to-night, Mr. Berrington," he said quietly, "and I have arranged that one of the stewardesses shall share Miss Challoner's cabin. Nobody can tell what secret plans the members of this gang may have made, and it's not safe, believe me it isn't, for either of you to spend the night unprotected. Locks, sometimes even bolts, form no barrier against these people, some of whom are almost sure to be on board, though I haven't as yet identified any among the passengers. You will remember that Lady Fitzgraham's cabin was ransacked last week, though she was in it, and the door locked on the inside. And poor Preston, we can't risk your sharing his fate." These ominous warnings would assuredly have filled me with alarm, had not Albeury's calmness and complete self-possession inspired me with a strange confidence. Somehow it seemed to me that so long as he was near no harm could befall either Dulcie or myself. Even Preston's presence had never inspired such confidence as this clever and far-seeing detective's presence had done ever since I had come to know him. But nothing happened. When I woke the next morning, after a night of sound rest, the boat was steaming slowly into port. Together the four of us journeyed back to town, and for the first time for many weeks I had an opportunity of a lengthy talk with Dulcie. Somehow her association with the woman Stapleton seemed to have broadened her views of life, though in all other respects she was absolutely unchanged. To me she seemed, if possible, more intensely attractive and lovable than during the period of our temporary estrangement. I realized now that we had, during those past weeks, been to all intents estranged. Perhaps, after all, the singular adventures she had experienced, some which she related to me were strange indeed, had served some good purpose that I did not know of. What most astonished me was that, during those weeks which she had spent in close companionship with Stapleton, Gastrell, Lorimer, and other members of the criminal organization, nothing had, until quite recently, been said that by any possibility could have led her to suppose that these friends of hers, as she had deemed them to be, were other than respectable members of society. Certainly, I reflected as she talked away now with the utmost candour and unconcern, these people must constitute one of the cleverest gangs of criminals there had ever been. The bare fact that its members were able to mix with such impunity in exclusive social circles proved that. Before the train left Newhaven, I had bought a number of newspapers, but not until we were half-way to London did it occur to me to look at any of them. It was not long, then, before I came across an announcement which, though I had half expected to see it, startled me a little. The report of my supposed suicide was brief enough, and then came quite a long account of my uneventful career, uneventful until recently. Turning to Dulcie, who, seated beside me, was staring out at the flying scenery, I handed her one of the papers, indicating the paragraph. "Good heavens, Mike!" she exclaimed when she had read it. "How awful! Supposing I had read that without knowing it to be untrue!" She held out the paper to Sir Roland. "Father, just read that," she said. He had heard me relate to Dulcie the story of my narrow escape in the forest near Martin de Blois, and I was pleased to see a smile at last come into his eyes, for since his cruel disillusionment he had looked terribly depressed. "After all," I said, as he put down the paper, "I am glad I returned to Paris, if only because my doing so has saved you from this shock." "If I had read that believing it to be true," he answered quietly, "the shock would probably have killed me." "Killed you!" I exclaimed. "Oh no, Sir Roland, a little thing like that would not have killed you. A family like yours takes a lot of killing, the records in history prove that." He gazed at me with a strange seriousness for some moments. At last he spoke. "Michael," he said, and there was an odd catch in his voice, "I wonder if you have the remotest conception of the strength of my attachment to you. I don't believe you have. And yet I could hardly be more attached to you than I am if you were my own son." When, after parting from Sir Roland and Dulcie in London, they were to return to Holt direct, I arrived with Albeury at my flat in South Molton Street, I found a stack of letters awaiting me, also several telegrams. Simon, my man, was expecting me. I had telegraphed from Newhaven, but almost directly he opened the door I noticed a change in his expression, and to some extent in his manner. Deferential, also curiously reserved, he had always been, but now there was a something in his eyes, a look which made me think he had something on his mind, something he wished to say to me, but dared not say. I had sent Albeury into my study to smoke a cigarette and drink a glass of wine while I went up to my room to have a bath. Simon was still busy with my things when I came out of the bathroom, and while I dressed, I took the opportunity of questioning him. "What's amiss, Simon?" I asked lightly. He looked up with a start. "Amiss, sir?" he repeated with obvious embarrassment. "I said amiss. Out with it." He seemed for some moments unable to meet my glance. Then suddenly he faced me unflinchingly. "Yes?" I said encouragingly, as he did not speak. "I'll tell you what's amiss, sir," he answered abruptly, forcing himself to speak. "The day after you'd left, a peculiar-looking man called here and asked to see you. When I told him you were not at home, he asked if you were out of town. I didn't answer that, sir, but I asked him quite politely if I couldn't give you any message. He answered no, that he must see you himself. Then he started to question me in a kind of roundabout way about you and your movements, sir." "I hope you kept your counsel," I exclaimed quickly, for excellent servant though Simon was, he occasionally lacked discretion. "Indeed I did, sir. Though I was quite courteous, I was a bit short with him. The next day he came again, about the same time it was close on dinner time and with him this time was another man, a rather younger man. They questioned me again, sir, quite friendly like, but they didn't get much out of me. Yesterday they tried it on a third time. Both of them come again, and well, sir, happening to put my hand into my jacket pocket soon after they were gone, I found these in it." As he spoke he dived into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Opening the envelope, he withdrew from it what I saw at a glance were bank notes. Unfolding them with trembling hands, which made the notes crackle noisily, he showed me that he had there 10 five-pound notes. "And they gave you those for nothing?" I asked, meaning to be ironical. "Well, sir, they didn't get anything in return, though they expect something in return, that's only natural. They said they'd come back to see me." "Did they say when they'd come back?" "To day, sir. About the same time as they come yesterday and the day before." He pulled out his watch. "It's close on 7 now. Perhaps you will like to see them if they come presently, sir?" "On the other hand, perhaps I shall not," I said, and I lit a cigarette. "At the same time, if they call, you can tell me." "Certainly, sir. If anybody rings, I'll come at once and tell you." He shuffled for a moment, then added: "And these notes, sir, am I entitled to keep them?" "Of course you are. Anybody has a right to accept and keep a gift. At the same time, I would warn you not to be disappointed if, when you try to cash them, you find the numbers have been stopped." Downstairs with Albeury, I began to look through my correspondence. The third telegram I opened puzzled me. "Is it all right? Dick." It had been awaiting me 2 days. Guessing that there must be a letter from Dick which would throw light on this telegram, I glanced quickly through the pile. I soon came to one addressed in his handwriting. I had to read it through twice before I fully realized what it all meant. Then I turned quickly to Albeury. "Read that," I said, pushing the letter to him across the table. He picked it up and adjusted his glasses. A few moments later he sprang suddenly to his feet. "My God, Mr. Berrington!" he exclaimed. "This is most serious, and it was written," he glanced at the date, "8 days ago, the very day you left London." "What is to be done?" I said quickly. "You may well ask," he answered. He looked up at the clock. "The police must be shown this at once, and under the circumstances told everything that happened in France. I had hoped to be able to entrap the gang without dealing with Scotland Yard direct." For some moments he paced the room. Never since I had met him had I seen him so perturbed. He was at all times singularly calm. I was not, however, surprised at his anxiety, for it seemed more than likely that quite unwittingly, and with the best intentions, Dick Challoner had not merely landed us in a terrible mess, but that he had certainly turned the tables upon us, leaving Dulcie and myself at the mercy of this desperate gang. On board the boat I had mentioned Dick to the detective and told him about the cipher and the part that Dick had played. He had not seemed impressed as I had expected him to be, and without a doubt he had not been pleased. All he said was, I now remembered: "It's a bad thing to let a boy get meddling with a matter of this kind, Mr. Berrington." He had said it in a tone of some annoyance. And now it would seem his view had been the right one. What Dick had done, according to this letter just received from him, had been to start advertising in the Morning Post, on his own account, in the cipher code which he had discovered, serious messages intended for the gang, and that must assuredly have been read by them. With his letter 2 cuttings were enclosed, his 2 messages already published. As I looked at them again a thought flashed across me. Now I knew how it came about that my impenetrable disguise had been discovered. Now I knew how it came about that Alphonse Furneaux had been released from the room where Preston had locked him in his flat. And now I knew why the members of the gang had left the Continental so suddenly, scattering themselves probably in all directions, and why the woman Stapleton had dashed back to London. I caught my breath as my train of thought hurried on. Another thought had struck me. I held my breath. Yes, it must be so. Try as I would, I could not possibly deceive myself. Dick had unwittingly been responsible for the murder of George Preston. This was the most awful blow of all. Unconsciously I looked up at the detective, who still paced the room. Instantly my eyes met his. He may have read in my eyes the horror that I felt, or the strength of my feeling may have communicated my thought to him, for at once he stood still, and staring straight at me, said in a tone of considerable emotion: "That boy has done a fearful thing, Mr. Berrington. He has—" "Stop! Stop!" I cried, raising my hand. "I know what you are going to say, but you mustn't blame him, Albeury. He did it without knowing, absolutely without knowing, and only you and I know that he is to blame. Dick must never know, never. Nobody else must ever know. If his father ever finds it out, it will kill him." For some moments Albeury remained quite still. His lip twitched. I had seen it twitch like that before, when he was deeply moved. At last he spoke. "Nobody shall ever know," he said in the same strained tone. He paused then. "I must talk on your telephone," he exclaimed suddenly, turning to leave the room. As he did so, Simon entered. "The two men are here, sir," he said. "I have told them you are quite alone. Shall I show them in?" Chapter 26. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 27 of The Four Faces by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 27. The Four Faces. They were quietly dressed, inoffensive-looking men, one a good deal younger than the other. Judged by their clothes and general appearance, they might have been gentlemen's servants or superior shop assistants. Directly they saw that I was not alone, the elder, whose age was 50 or so, said in a tense voice: "We wish to see you alone, Mr. Berrington. Our business is quite private." "You can talk openly before this gentleman," I answered, for at a glance from me Albeury had remained in the room. "What do you want to see me about?" "In private, please, Mr. Berrington," he repeated doggedly, not heeding my question. "Either you speak to me in this gentleman's presence," I answered, controlling my irritation, "or not at all. What do you want?" They hesitated for barely an instant, and I thought my firmness had disconcerted them, when suddenly I saw them exchange a swift glance. The younger man stepped quickly back to the door, which was close behind him, and without turning locked it. As he did so his companion sprang to one side with a sharp cry. Albeury had him covered with a revolver. The younger man had already slipped his hand into his pocket when I sprang upon him. Though some years have passed since I practiced jiu jitsu, I have not forgotten the different holds. In a moment I had his arms locked behind him. Had he attempted to struggle then he must have broken his wrist. Turning, I saw that Albeury had the other man still at his mercy with the revolver. Not for an instant did he look away from him. I was about to call loudly to Simon to call the police, when the elder man spoke. "Stop!" he gasped, just above a whisper. "You have done us. Give us a chance to escape, and we'll help you." "Help me? How?" I said, still gripping my man tightly. "What have you come for? What did you want?" "We're under orders, so help me we are!" he exclaimed huskily. "We had at any cost to see you." "And for that you bribed my man, or tried to?" "Yes, to let us see you alone." Albeury's arm, extended over the cocked revolver, was as rigid as a rock. The muzzle covered the man's chest. Again the man glanced swiftly at the detective, then went on, speaking quickly. "If you'll let us go we'll tell you everything anything you want to know." I glanced in inquiry at Albeury. Though his gaze was still set upon his man, he caught my look. "Right. We'll let you go," he said, without moving, "if you'll tell us everything. Now speak. Why are you here?" "We're under orders," the man repeated. "We were not to leave this flat with him alive in it." He jerked his chin at me. "If we do we shall be killed ourselves when the Four Faces know. But you've done us. We've got to escape now somehow, if you'll let us, and our only way is to give you information that'll help you to get the whole gang arrested. You've discovered a code we use, and you've tampered with it, and that's what's done it." "Done what?" "Got the Four Faces down on you, and made them set on killing you." "Whom do you mean by the Four Faces?" "Why, the men and women. You know them. Gastrell, Stapleton, and the rest, the gang known as the Four Faces." "Why are they known as the Four Faces?" "Because there are four heads, each being known as the Fat Face, the Long Face, the Thin Face, and the Square Face, and each head has four others of the gang directly under his or her orders." "And Gastrell and Stapleton are Faces?" "Yes." "But Gastrell is dead." "Dead? Gastrell? Impossible." "Yes, go on." For some moments astonishment held him dumb. "Gastrell and the rest of them will be at Eldon Hall in Northumberland the day after to morrow," he said at last, "for the coming of age of Cranmere's son. The house is to be looted, cleaned out. Everything is arranged, the plan is perfect, as all the arrangements of the Four Faces always are. It can't fail unless—" "Yes?" "Now that you know, you can warn Cranmere. You must warn him to be very careful, for if they get wind there's suspicion about, they'll drop it and you won't catch them. You know the robberies and other things there've been and nobody's been caught? They've not even been suspected. Now's your chance to get them all, the first real chance there's ever been. But you mustn't show up, mind that. The house is watched, to see when we come out. Nor you nor your man must go out of this flat till the gang's been caught, every one of them. It's the day after to morrow they'll be at Eldon Hall. They're expecting a gigantic haul there, including all the Cranmere diamonds. They're worth thousands on thousands. You're both known by sight, and if you're seen about, we're just as bad as dead." He stopped abruptly, and then went on. "And you mustn't answer if anybody rings or knocks, and you mustn't answer the telephone. You understand? Nobody must answer it. It's got to be supposed you're both in here, dead, you and your man. They've got to think we done it. There's no one else living in this flat, we know that." "I can't warn Lord Cranmere if I don't go out of here." "He can." He indicated the detective. "He can go out at any time. They don't know he's in here. If we'd known you'd anybody with you, we'd have come another time. Your man said you were alone, quite alone, he said, and well, we thought the 50 quid had squared him." Still holding my man tightly in the jiu jitsu grip, I again spoke quickly to the detective. "Is he lying?" I asked. "Is it safe to let him go?" "Quite safe," he answered, without a moment's hesitation. "I know them both. This fellow has been 4 times in jail. The first time was 17 years ago. He got 14 months for burglary. The second time was 13 years ago, for attempted murder, when he got 5 years. The third was 11 years ago. The fourth was 9 years back. He's got half a dozen aliases or more, and your man, let me see, yes, he's been once in jail, 10 years for forgery, went in when he was 18 and not been out above 3 years. It's safe to let them go, quite safe. They've spoken straight this time. Couldn't help themselves." While Albeury was speaking, I had seen the men gasp. They were staring at him now with a look of abject terror, but still I held my man. "I don't like to risk it," I expostulated. "The whole tale may be a plant." "It's not, Mr. Berrington. I tell you they're straight this time. They've got to be, to save their skins. I could put the yard onto them right away, but it wouldn't serve our purpose. The gang would then escape." His revolver still covered the elder man's chest. "Hand out your gun," he said sharply, "and empty out your pockets, both of you." Soon everything the men's pockets had contained lay upon the floor. Among the things were 3 pistols, 2 jemmies, some curious little bottles, and some queer-looking implements I couldn't guess the use of. Just then a thought occurred to me. "But if they'd have robbed this flat," I said, "if what they say is true." "You are mistaken," Albeury answered. "They didn't come for robbery, but on a more serious errand to put an end to you. I know the methods of this gang pretty well, I can assure you. You would have been found dead, and your man dead too, most likely, and the circumstances attending your death would all have pointed to suicide, or perhaps to accidental death. But we've not much time to spare. Come." He turned to the men. "Come over here, both of you," he said sharply, and signalled to me to release my man. I did so. To my surprise, both men seemed cowed. In silence, and without attempt at violence, they followed Albeury across to the escritoire. At that moment it was that the bell of the flat rang loudly. Without stirring, we stood expectantly waiting. I had unlocked the door of my room, and presently Simon entered. "Mr. Osborne would like to see you, sir," he said in his usual tone of deference. "When I told him you had visitors, he said he wouldn't come in. He's waiting at the door, sir." "Jack! Splendid!" I exclaimed. "The very man we want to see. You have heard me speak of Mr. Osborne, Albeury, and you know plenty about him." I turned to Simon. "Show him in here at once," I said. "If he still hesitates, say I want particularly to see him." It seemed quite a long time since last I had met Osborne, on the night we had gone together with poor Preston to Willow Road and had afterwards been followed by Alphonse Furneaux. I had felt so annoyed with Jack for becoming enamoured of Jasmine Gastrell after all we had come to know about her, that I had felt in no hurry to renew my friendship with him. But now circumstances had arisen and things had changed. If he were still infatuated with the woman, we should, between the lot of us, I thought, quickly be able to disillusion him. He looked rather serious as he entered, and glanced from one to another of us inquiringly. I introduced Albeury to him. As I mentioned Albeury's name, I saw the two scoundrels start. Evidently he was well known to them by name, and probably by repute. "As I was passing I looked in," Osborne said, "as we haven't run across each other for such a long time, but I don't know that I've got anything in particular to say to you, and you seem to be engaged." "But I have something particular to say to you," I answered quickly, coming at once to the point, as Simon left the room and shut the door behind him. "You've made pretty much of a fool of yourself with that Gastrell woman, Jack," I went on, with difficulty restraining the indignation I felt. "You are largely responsible for terrible things that have happened during the past few days, including the murder of George Preston." "Murder? The newspapers said it was suicide." "Of course they did. It was arranged that they should. Now listen, Jack," I continued seriously. "We are on the eve of what may prove to be a tremendous tragedy, of an event that in any case is going to make an enormous sensation, nothing less than the capture, or attempted capture, of the whole of the notorious and dangerous gang that a short time ago you appeared to be so desperately anxious to bring to justice. These two men," I indicated them, "belong to the gang in the sense that they are employed by it, but they have now turned King's evidence." In a few words I outlined to him exactly what had happened. As I stopped speaking, Albeury interrupted. "And if you will now listen, Mr. Osborne," he said, "you will hear a complete statement of facts which should interest you." With that he pulled a notebook out of his pocket, opened it, laid it flat on the escritoire, and seated himself, producing his fountain pen. Both men stood beside him. Rapidly he cross-questioned them, writing quickly down in shorthand every word they spoke. Almost endless were the questions he put concerning the whole gang. One by one the name of each member of it was entered in the notebook, followed by an address which the men declared would find him or her. The number of members, we thus discovered, amounted to over 20, of whom no less than 8 were women. Jasmine Gastrell's career was described in detail, also Connie Stapleton's, Doris Lorimer's, Bob Challoner's, Hugesson Gastrell's, and the careers of all the rest in addition. The names of some of these were known to us, but the majority were not. Incidentally, we now found out that Hugesson Gastrell had never been in Australia, nor yet in Tasmania, and that the whole story of his having been left a fortune by his uncle was wholly without foundation. The natural son of well-to-do people in Yorkshire, he had been launched penniless on to the world to make his way as best he could, and the rapidity with which he had increased his circle of acquaintance among rich and useful people from the time he had become a member of the gang had not been the least remarkable feature in his extraordinary career. I shall never forget that cross-examination, or the rapidity with which it was conducted. In the course of a quarter of an hour many mysteries which had long puzzled us were revealed, many problems solved. The woman whose stabbed and charred body had been found among the débris of the house in Maresfield Gardens burnt down on Christmas Day was, it seemed, another of Gastrell's victims. He had stabbed her to death, and the house had been fired with a view to destroying all traces of the crime. Questioned further, the elder of the two scoundrels went on to state that he had been in the house in Maresfield Gardens on the night that Osborne and I had called there, just before Christmas, the night we had driven up there from Brooks's club, on the pretext of Osborne's having found at the club a purse which he believed, so he had told the woman Gastrell, to have been dropped by Hugesson Gastrell. Other members of the gang had been in the house at that time, the man said. Just before we entered they had been in the very room into which Jasmine Gastrell had shown us when she had at last admitted us, which of course accounted for the dirty tumblers I had noticed on the table, and the chair that had felt hot when I sat in it. She had first opened the door to us, the man continued, under the impression that we were additional members of the gang whom she expected. Our rings at the door had accidentally coincided with the rings these men would have given. Then at once, discovering her mistake, and recognizing Osborne's voice, she had deemed it prudent to admit us, thinking thus to allay any suspicion her unusual reception might otherwise arouse in us. He told us, too, that the great cobra kept by Gastrell he had owned it from the time it was a tiny thing a foot long had once or twice been used by him in connection with murders for which he had been responsible. It was far from being harmless, though Gastrell had declared to us that night that it couldn't harm anybody if it tried. Indeed, it seemed that his first intention had been to let it attack us, for he feared that our having recognized him might arouse our suspicion and indirectly lead to his arrest, and for that reason he had, while we were left in darkness in the hall, opened the aperture in the wall through which it was allowed to pass into the room into which Jasmine Gastrell had then admitted us. But a little later, deeming that the crime might be discovered in spite of all the precautions that he would have taken to conceal it, he had suddenly changed his mind, unlocked the door, and come to our rescue at the last moment. The mysterious affair in Grafton Street had been arranged. They went on to say, when threatened by Albeury with arrest if they refused to tell everything, by Hugesson Gastrell and two accomplices, the two men with whom Osborne had entered into conversation on the night of Gastrell's reception in Cumberland Place, and it was a member of the gang, whose name I had not heard before, the sole occupant of the house at the time, who had questioned Osborne in the dark. Upon the unexpected arrival of the police at Grafton Street, this man had clambered through a skylight in the roof, crawled along the roofs of several houses, and there remained hidden until nightfall, when he escaped down a thieves' ladder, which is made of silk rope, and so contrived that upon the thieves reaching the ground, he can detach it from the chimney stack to which it has been fastened. Jasmine Gastrell herself it was who had sent Dulcie the telegram signed with my name, her intention being to decoy me into the Grafton Street house, where I should have shared Osborne's unpleasant experience. It was Gastrell who had murdered Churchill, who had murdered Preston on board the boat they declared they didn't know, nor could they say for certain who had inserted in the newspaper the cipher messages disentangled by Dick, for Gastrell, Stapleton, Jasmine Gastrell, and other leaders of the gang were in the habit of communicating with their crowd of confederates by means of secret codes. Incidentally, they mentioned that Connie Stapleton was in reality Gastrell's wife, and that Jasmine was his mistress, though Harold Logan, found in the hiding hole at Holt, had been madly in love with her. "There," I said, turning to Jack Osborne as Albeury ended his cross-examination. "Now you've got it all in black and white. And that's the woman you've been fooling with, and say you're going to marry? Not merely an adventuress, but a criminal who has herself instigated common burglaries, and has connived at and been an accessory to murders. You must be mad, Jack. Stark, staring. For heaven's sake, get over your absurd infatuation." "It's not infatuation on my side only, Mike," he answered, with a curious look that came near to being pathetic. "Jasmine is in love with me. She really is. It sounds absurd, I know, under the circumstances, but you know what women are, and the most extraordinary attachments they sometimes form, yes, even the worst of them. She's promised to start afresh, lead a straight life, if only I'll marry her. She has indeed, and what's more, she'll do it." I heard Albeury snort, and even the scoundrels who had stood by looking on and listening grin. "In 48 hours she'll be arrested and sent to jail," I said calmly. "Don't be such an utter idiot, Jack." He sprang to his feet. "Jasmine arrested?" he cried. "My God, she shan't be! I'll go to her now. I'll warn her. "You'll do nothing of the sort," Albeury interrupted. "We've a trap set for the whole crew, more than 20 of them in all, and if you warn that woman she'll tell the rest, and then well, what? Our plan will be defeated. More than that, the whole lot of us in this room will be murdered as sure as I'm sitting here. You've heard the truth about this gang from these two men. You know what a desperate crowd they are. What they'd be like if they get their backs against the wall you ought to be able to guess. Mr. Osborne, unless you pledge your solemn word that you'll not warn Jasmine Gastrell, I shall be forced to retain you here. Mr. Berrington has told you that I am an international police detective. I have, under the circumstances, the power to arrest you." Osborne was evidently terribly upset. For a minute he sat, thinking deeply. A glance showed how madly in love he obviously was with the woman. Looking at him, I wondered whether what he had said could by any possibility be true, that Jasmine Gastrell had really lost her heart to him. The idea at first thought seemed absurd, even grotesque. And yet suddenly Jack looked up. "Supposing," he said, speaking with great deliberation, "I pledge my solemn word that I won't warn her of what you intend to do, or give her any reason to suspect that such a plot exists, and that I undertake to take her abroad with me and keep her there for 1 year from now. I shall marry her at once. Will you undertake that she shall leave the country unmolested and be left unmolested?" I looked inquiringly at Albeury. "Yes," he said at once. "I agree to that. We both agree to that. That's so, Mr. Berrington?" I nodded. A thing I liked about Albeury was that he made up his mind almost instantly, that he never hesitated a moment. "All the same, Mr. Osborne," he added quickly, "you must pardon my saying that I consider you barely sane. It's no business of mine, I know, but do for God's sake think what you are doing before you bind yourself for life to such a woman. Think of it. For life." "That's all right," Jack answered quietly. "Don't distress yourself. I know exactly what I am doing, and" he paused, looking hard at Albeury. "From now onward," he said slowly, "Jasmine Gastrell will be a wholly different woman. I am going away with her at once, Albeury. To morrow at latest. We may even leave to night. We shall not return to England for a year. That I promise you. For a year I shall see neither Berrington, nor you, nor any of my friends. But in a year's time you and Berrington and I, and Jasmine too, will meet again. And then—" The telephone in the flat rang loudly. Albeury sprang up. An instant later he was in the hall, preventing Simon from answering the call. Quickly he returned, while the bell continued ringing. "What's your code, Morse?" he said sharply to the men. "No, secret," the older man answered. "Quickly then, go. If it's not for you, say so." Carefully the man Albeury had cross-questioned unhooked the receiver. He held it to his ear, and an instant later nodded. Then, with the pencil which hung down by a string, he tapped the transmitter 5 times, with measured beat. Still holding the receiver to his ear, he conversed rapidly by means of taps with his confederates at the other end. From where we stood, close by, the taps at the other end were faintly audible. For nearly 5 minutes this conversation by code continued. Then the man hung up the receiver and faced us. "I done it," he said. "Now me and my pal can get away from here at once, and both of you," indicating Albeury and Osborne, "we shall meet our pals who watch this house. We shall meet them in Tottenham Court Road in half an hour. I've told them we've done out Mr. Berrington and his man. They think you both dead. It's a deal, then?" "What's a deal?" I asked. "That you and your man stick in here until after the gang has been taken." "Yes, that's understood." "And that you won't answer any bell or knock, nor any telephone, nor show any sign of life, till after they've been took?" "Of course. That's all arranged." "Then we'll go, and good luck to you." A few moments later we heard them going down the stairs. At once Albeury called Osborne and myself into the room we had just left. Then he rang for Simon. Everything was quickly settled. Albeury was to go at once to Scotland Yard and make arrangements for the arrest of the gang at Eldon Hall on the following day but one. The arrival of the large body of detectives that would be needed would have, as he explained, to be planned with the greatest secrecy. After that he would catch the night express to the north, and on the following morning himself call at Eldon Hall to see Lord Cranmere. He would not alarm him in the least, he said. He would tell him merely that there were suspicions of a proposed attempted robbery, and asked leave to station detectives. "And I'm to stay here with Simon, I suppose," I said despondently, "until everything is finished?" "Not a bit of it," he answered. "Simon will stay here, and with him a detective who will arrive to night at midnight. We may need you at Eldon Hall, and you must be there." "Meet you there? But I have promised those men that. Besides, suppose I am seen?" "As far as those scoundrels are concerned," he answered, "all they care about is to save their wretched skins. You won't be seen, that I'll guarantee, but none the less you must be there. It's absolutely necessary. A closed car will await you at the Bond Street Tube station at 3 o'clock to-morrow morning. Ask the driver no questions. He will have his orders." Some minutes later Albeury left us. Osborne had already gone. I told Simon, who had been taken into our confidence, to pack a few necessaries in a small bag for me, and then, seated alone, smoking a cigar for the first time since my return, I allowed my thoughts to wander. Chapter 27. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 28 of The Four Faces by William Le Queux. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 28. The Faces Unmasked. Eldon Hall is one of those fine old country mansions so much admired, and not infrequently coveted by, rich Americans who come over to "do England." It was a late Colonel North of nitrate fame who, upon visiting Killeen Castle, in County Meath, with a view to buying the place for his son, laconically observed, "Yes, it's not a bad old pile, but much too ramshackle for my son. I could manage to live in it, I dare say, yet if my son buys it he'll pull it down and rebuild it," a remark which tickled its owner a good deal. Eldon Hall in Northumberland is fully as old and in some respects as venerable a pile as Killeen Castle, though its architecture is wholly different. Many attempts have been made to fix the date of Eldon. The property has been in Lord Cranmere's family from a period, as the lawyers say, so far back that the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, but experts differ considerably in their opinions. This is due to the fact that though a portion of the old place is undoubtedly Elizabethan, there yet are portions obviously of a much earlier date. According to several authorities, the earlier building must at some period have been in part destroyed, most probably, they say, by fire, the portion left intact being then deserted for generations, and towards the end of the 16th century inhabited again, when, it is further conjectured, the latter part must have been built. The effect produced by this architectural medley is bizarre in the extreme, and many and strange are the local legends and traditions connected with Eldon Hall. Situated on the slope of a gigantic ravine, 12 miles from the nearest town, and 8 from the nearest railway station, and the roads in that part of Northumberland being far from good, until the advent of the automobile, Eldon Hall was looked upon by many as, in a sense, inaccessible. The houses being far from the beaten track, few excursionists or trippers came near the place in those days, and indeed even to day the sightseers who find their way there are for the most part Americans. From the ridge of hills which shuts in and practically surrounds the estate, hills all densely wooded, a panoramic and truly glorious view can be obtained of the wonderfully picturesque scenery that upholds itself on all sides. Here then it was that, on the 28th day of February, 1912, many hundreds of people from all parts of the country, exclusive of local residents and of Lord Cranmere's own tenantry, were to assemble for a week of festivity and rejoicing which, so rumour said, would eclipse anything of the kind ever before seen at Eldon, which long had been famous for its outbursts of entertainment. Lord Cranmere's elder son, who was about to come of age, was like the typical athletic young Briton. Tall, well built, handsome, with plenty of self-assurance and a wholly unaffected manner, he was worthy of his father's pride. It was no exaggeration to say that everybody, rich and poor alike, who came into contact with him, at once fell under the spell of his attractive personality. A popular man himself, Lord Cranmere had always been, but his outlook upon life was somewhat narrow. In spite of his opportunities he had seen little of life and had few interests beyond fox hunting, game shooting, and salmon fishing. His eldest son, on the contrary, had from the age of 18 travelled constantly. Twice already he had been round the world, and so quick was his power of observation that at 21 he knew more of life and of things that matter than many a man of his class and twice his age. It was a glorious morning, the sun shining brightly and strangely warm for February, as the car in which I had travelled from London with 3 companions, all of them Scotland Yard men, pulled up at a farmhouse within 2 miles of Eldon. The journey from London, begun at 3 in the morning on the previous day, had been broken at Skipton, near Harrogate, where we had spent the night. Now, as the 5 of us, for our driver was also, I discovered, a member of the force, walked briskly along the narrow winding lane in the direction of the park which surrounds Eldon Hall. The morning air was refreshing, also intensely invigorating. We looked little enough like London men, and I doubt whether anybody meeting us would for an instant have supposed that we were not what we intended that we should look like, namely, well-to-do tenantry of Lord Cranmere's bound for the scene of the coming-of-age festivities. It was barely 9 o'clock, and at 11 the morning sports were to begin. Several carts overtook us, loaded with cheery fellows, some of whom shouted rustic jests as they passed us by, which my companions were quick to acknowledge. We had walked, I suppose, rather less than a mile, when we suddenly came to a stile. "Here's our short cut," the man who walked beside me said, as he stopped abruptly. "Many's the time I've climbed over this stile more years ago than I like to think, sir," he remarked lightly. "My father was under-keeper to his lordship's father, and I've not been back since 20 years. It's not a bit changed, though, the old place. Not a bit. I'm going when I retire on my pension to live down here again. I want to leave my bones where I was born, and where my fathers and mothers are. It's a fine country this, sir, not a county like it in the whole of England," he added with enthusiasm. "And you see yonder cross-roads? That's Clun Cross. There's said to be a highwayman buried at that cross-roads with a stake pushed through his body." Clun Cross. I remembered that name at once. It was a name that had appeared in one of the advertisements deciphered by Dick. We made our way up the steep footpath which led across a cramped field. Now we were on the boundary of a thickly underwooded cover. "There's not a tree in this wood I don't remember," he said, looking about him as we scrambled up the bridle path. Bracken up to our waist was on both sides, and it grew and hung over so thickly that the path was barely visible. As we reached the top of the track he gave a low whistle. Instantly the whistle was answered. A moment later half a dozen men rose up out of the undergrowth. At the foot of a clump of pine trees in the middle of the wood we lay down to confer. Then it was I learned for the first time something of the line of action the police had decided to adopt. 40 police officers in various disguises, the majority dressed to look like the tenantry in their holiday clothes, were, it seemed, concealed in the various covers, in addition to a dozen disguised as labourers, stationed in the fields beside the roads leading to Eldon Hall. Besides these were 15 officers, guests to all appearances, who would arrive with the other guests and mingle with them freely. There were also 8 men disguised as hired waiters, who would help the servants below stairs in the hall, and 5 female detectives assisting the maids in their work. "You've got the revolver I gave you?" the gamekeeper's son said, turning to me suddenly. His name, he had told me, was Ross. "Yes, though I all but forgot it." "Let me see it," he said. I produced it from my pocket and handed it over. "I thought so," he exclaimed. "Not loaded." He loaded it with the cartridges I gave him, then gave it back to me. Half an hour passed. One by one the men had risen and wandered away. Now only 3 remained. 10 minutes later 2 more rose and went, leaving me alone with Ross. His reminiscences of gamekeeping, a calling he seemed still to love, and of the former Lord Cranmere and his relations and all his friends, also his experiences during the 18 years he had been in the police force, were interesting to listen to. Brighter and brighter the sun shone. The weather was almost spring-like, and no breath of wind stirred. Half a mile or so away, in the valley far beneath us, Well-dressed men and women sauntered in the gardens and out upon the lawns. Larger and larger grew the number of these guests. From varying distances came the sound of cars rapidly approaching. In the broad, flat meadow, far down to our right, sports of different sorts were in progress. Beyond them were swings and similar attractions where children in their hundreds thronged and clustered. In all directions flew flags and bunting, while the sharp reports of the shooting gallery rifles were audible above the blare of the roundabout steam organs. Ross pulled out his field glass, and kneeling up in the deep bracken, focused the crowds in turn. It was now past noon. From the lawn facing the house the strains of a Strauss valse, played by an excellent band, floated up to where we knelt, though the racket of the steam organs clashed with it to some extent. Slowly the time crept on. Longer and longer grew the approaching queue of cars. In one field alone, set aside as a garage, I counted over 100. Others were left out in the stable yards. Others could be seen deserted by the roadsides. Beyond the band upon the lawn mammoth marquees had been erected, in which lunch for the vast concourse would presently be served. Already servants in their dozens hurried in and out as they made ready for the feast. "About the queerest job I've ever had a hand in, this is," Ross observed presently, lowering his glass. "What do you make of it, Mr. Berrington?" "Nothing as yet," I answered. "What puzzles me is, why did they want to bring me here?" Ross chuckled. "He's most likely got some reason," he presently murmured. "I don't suppose Albeury'd fetch you here for your health." Again he focused his glass. Now the people were gradually drifting. Slowly the crowds began to surge in the direction where the tents stood. Now the tents were filling fast. Once more the band was playing. Everyone seemed happy. Joy and laughter were in the air. Engrossed in the panorama which interested me considerably, all thought of my reasons for being there had for the moment faded from my mind, and "Hark!" Ross exclaimed. He remained silent, listening. "What did you hear?" I asked, when half a minute had passed. "Didn't you hear it?" "No, what?" "That buzzing sound. It wasn't a car, I'm certain. I believe it was a there, listen." I heard it now distinctly. Away to our right it sounded, high in the air apparently, a strange humming noise. "An aeroplane?" He nodded. Quickly the sound increased in volume. Now we saw that the crowds down in the valley had heard it. They were gazing up in the sky, away to our right. Now they were getting excited. Like ants they hurried about. Out of the tents they swarmed, like bees out of a hive that has been stirred up with a stick. And now out of the house too they came hurrying, guests, men and maidservants, hired helpers, everybody. The humming grew louder and louder. "Scott, what an idea!" "Idea?" I exclaimed. "What do you mean?" "We'd a rumour before leaving town that something unexpected and startling might occur in connection with this affair. This is it, you may depend." Still I was perplexed. "I don't follow your line of thought," I said. "What can an aeroplane have to do with the gang, or they with it? They wouldn't come down in an aeroplane to commit a robbery, surely?" He looked at me, as I thought pityingly, as though sorry for my lack of imagination or intelligence, or both. Now everybody was rushing about. All were hurrying in one direction. A few later stragglers still came stumbling out of the house, running as fast as their legs would carry them. The humming sounded just above our heads. Looking up, we suddenly saw the aeroplane. A large biplane containing 2 passengers, it passed not 30 feet above us, flying horizontally in a straight line. Now it descended a little way, then slowly began to circle. At that moment we heard a shot fired somewhere in the woods. "Our signal," Ross murmured. "Are you ready to go?" "Go where?" "You'll see." The aeroplane was descending rapidly. Almost immediately beneath it was gathered a dense crowd. Looking through Ross's glass, I saw one of the passengers waving to the crowd to clear out of the way. A moment later, and the biplane was dashing straight at the people beneath. "Quick, my glass!" I handed it to him. Instantly he levelled it in the direction of the house. "See those men?" he said, pointing. I turned in the direction he was looking. In the main road, just beyond the house, 2 men seemed to be busy with a large car. As I looked, a third man appeared in the roadway, walking quickly towards them. He stepped into the car behind the one where the two men already were, and crouching was at once lost to sight. "Come, quickly!" Ross exclaimed. "You see the idea now? That aeroplane arrival is a ruse to distract everybody's attention. There's never been an aeroplane up here before. This is the first time most of that crowd, except the guests, have ever seen one. When we get into that house you'll find it completely deserted, or apparently so, but some of the gang will be busy there, that you may depend upon. Our men are already there." With all speed we scrambled through the bracken and down the steep slope towards the house. In 5 minutes or less we were within 50 yards of Eldon Hall. The back door stood wide open. Entering cautiously, we found ourselves in the kitchen premises. Kitchen, pantry, every room and the stone flagged passages were deserted. A moment or two later we pushed open a spring door, to find ourselves in the hall. Nobody was there either, and the front door stood ajar. "Off with your boots, quick!" A glance into the various downstairs rooms, all of which were deserted, then up the front stairs we crept in our stocking feet. On the landing 2 men stepped noiselessly out of a doorway. Both, I saw, were detectives in rubber shoes. "You know the men of the gang by sight?" one of them whispered as he stood beside me. "Some of them," I answered. "And they know who you are, we understand?" "Yes." "Then if you meet one, shoot. He'll shoot you if you don't shoot first." My hand trembled with excitement as I clutched the pistol in my pocket. My mouth was dry. I could hear my heart thumping. Cautiously I followed Ross along the corridor. Suddenly a loud report almost deafened me. At the same instant Ross fell forward onto his face with a hideous crash. I can hear it now as I think of it. A moment later a man dashed past me and tore furiously down the stairs. Springing after him, I fired wildly as he ran, once, twice. I had missed him, and he was gone. In one of the rooms I could distinctly hear sounds of a scuffle. There were blows, some oaths, and a muffled groan. Now the house was suddenly in uproar. The deafening sound of several shots echoed along the corridors. 2 men were running towards me. Wildly I flung out my arm, the revolver in my hand aimed point blank at one of them, and then something struck me from behind, a fearful blow, and stumbling, I lost consciousness. I was in a room, almost in darkness. Like shadows, 2 figures moved noiselessly about. They were figures I didn't recognize. My head ached fearfully. Where was I? What had happened? I remembered groaning feebly, and seeing the 2 figures quickly turn towards me. Again all was blank. Conclusion. It was broad daylight now, but the blinds were all pulled down. I was in the same room. My head felt on fire. Never had I suffered so terribly. Never, I hope and trust, shall I suffer so again. A woman beside the bed gently held my wrist. A nurse. Something soothing was passed between my lips. It relieved me. I felt better. Many days passed before I became convalescent. Dark days of nightmare, hideous days of pain. A month elapsed before I was allowed to ask questions concerning that awful day and all that had taken place. 3 of the detectives had been shot dead. Poor Ross had been the first victim. 5 had been seriously wounded. Several others had been injured, but the entire gang of the Four Faces had finally been captured. Some had been arrested in the house, red-handed. Among these were Connie Stapleton and Doris Lorimer. Guests at Eldon for the week, they had been discovered in Mrs. Stapleton's bedroom, in the act of packing into a bag jewellery belonging to Lord and Lady Cranmere. Others had been run down in the woods. Several had been arrested on suspicion at Clun Cross, and upon them had been found evidence proving their identity. 6 cars had been held up and their occupants taken into custody. What upset me most when all this was told to me was the news of poor Ross's death. During the short time I had known him, I had taken a strong liking to him. He had seemed such a thoroughly honest fellow, so straightforward in every way. He had a wife and several children, he had told me. Several times he had spoken of his wife, to whom he had evidently been devoted. And he had so looked forward to the time, now only 2 years off, when he would have retired on his pension and return to his native county, return to settle down if possible on the Eldon Hall estate. Yet in an instant he had been shot down like a dog by one of those scoundrels he was helping to arrest. It all seemed too terrible, too sad. Well, as soon as I was sufficiently recovered to get about again, I would, I decided, visit his widow in London and see if I could help her in any way. 6 weeks had passed, and I was almost well again. Once more I was staying at Holt Manor. Already the breath of spring was in the air. Sir Roland, recovered at last from the mental shock he had sustained, was there. Aunt Hannah was away, making her annual round of visits. Dulcie and I were wholly undisturbed, except by little Dick, who was at home for his Easter holidays. As we sauntered in the beautiful woods on a sunny afternoon towards the end of April, discussing our plans for the honeymoon, for we were to be married in a week's time, Dulcie suddenly asked, apropos of nothing: "Mike, why did that detective, Albeury, make you go to Eldon Hall? You were not to take part in the capture. You could quite well have stayed in London." "In a way, that was a mistake," I answered. "He never intended that I should go further than the farm 2 miles from the Hall, where we had pulled up. He thought he would need me to identify some of the men about to be arrested, and so he wanted me on the spot. But he had not told me why he wanted me there, so when the police officers prepared to start out for Eldon from the farm, naturally I insisted upon going with them. I wanted to see some of the fun, or what I thought was going to be an extremely exciting event." "Which it proved to be," she said seriously. Just then I remembered something. "Look, my darling," I said, "what I received this morning." I drew out of my pocket a letter and handed it to her. It bore a German postmark. It had been postmarked in Alsace-Lorraine. She unfolded the letter and slowly read it through. "How dreadful!" she said. "Poor Jack!" I paused. "It may not be," I said at last. "All his life he has done odd and unexpected things, and they have generally turned out well. He has written to me twice since he left England, and I am convinced now that he and Jasmine Gastrell, or rather Jasmine Osborne, are tremendously in love with each other. I told you of his idea that she would, when he had married her, entirely change her life. Perhaps that idea is not as quixotic as we first thought." "Perhaps, if they really love each other " she began, then stopped abruptly. "My darling," I murmured, "is there any miracle that love isn't able to accomplish? Look what you have faced, what I have faced, during these dreadful months of anxiety and peril. It was love alone that strengthened us, love alone that held us together in those moments of terrible crisis. Come." So we turned slowly homeward in the golden light of the spring afternoon, secure in our love for one another, and in the knowledge that the black shadows which had darkened our lives during the past few months had at last vanished for ever. This is the end of The Four Faces by William Le Queux. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com.